So, Mordecai, what a guy. That's what we're looking at the moment. Last week we were looking at this picture of Mordecai mirroring or showing us God as our loving adoptive father, and also Esther interceding on behalf of Israel as Christ interceding on behalf of us later. So there's that foreshadowing there in Esther. And also we were looking at this person, Mordecai, Esther's adoptive father, her cousin. And we were looking last week about him living honorably, doing what is true, what is noble, what is right, what is pure, what is lovely, and what is admirable, despite living in a very ungodly, hedonistic culture. Well, this week we're still looking at Mordecai, going into Esther 3, and I did give a few hints away last week, you'll remember. And you might be thinking, well, hang about, I thought you said we were doing a preaching series on Esther. Why have we got 2 weeks solid on Mordecai? Well, at the end of the day, you can't look at Esther without looking at Mordecai. He plays an integral part of the role in this story of Esther and in Esther's story herself. If the book of Esther was a film and it was nominated for an Oscar, then Esther would be getting the leading actress and Mordecai is getting the best supporting actor role. So that's why we're preaching on Mordecai. You'll notice how we preached through Esther twice. We looked at Esther in Esther 2 once, and then we looked at Mordecai in Esther 2. And we're moving on to Esther 3 this week. And as you'll notice, as I read that in just a moment, Esther isn't even mentioned in Esther 3. So this is all about Mordecai. And also we get introduced this week to the villain of the book of Esther. If you'd like to turn with me to Esther 3, verse 1 to 15, which is all of Esther 3. So Esther 3. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. When the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet, having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. In the 12th year of the king Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, they cast the pur, that is, the lot, in the presence of Haman to select a day and month. And the lot fell on the 12th month and the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, whose customs are different from those of all other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interests to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for the men who carry out this business." So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. "Keep the money," the king said to Haman, "and do with the people as you please." Then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people all Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles of the various peoples. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the orders to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and little children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so that they would be ready for that day. Spurred on by the king's command, the couriers went out, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink. The city of Susa was bewildered. Let's pray. Lord God, we pray, Lord, as we look in Esther 3 this week, and we look at Mordecai again, and we look at this man Haman as well, Lord, who is against you, against your people, Lord. I pray, Lord, that we will learn something this week, Lord. I pray, Lord, that you will speak to us this week, Lord. Amen. So last week we saw Mordecai living honorably where he was in Susa, in the citadel of Susa in Persia, but living honorably before God as well. And this week we see that that's put to the test by this man called Haman. So before we go any further, like we did last week, delving into who Mordecai was, let's delve into who this man Haman is. So Mordecai is a Persian name. We don't have his Hebrew name. Haman is a Persian name, but he's not Persian, or at least not directly. It tells us his father's name, but then more importantly, it tells us that he is an Agagite or an Agite. And nearly all of the scholars agree that this means that he was descended from Agag, the king of Amalek. So just like Mordecai, who is now in Susa and has a certain role within the Persian government, despite being not Persian, despite being descended from Israel, there's this man Haman, who is descended from the Amaleks, and he's also in a position of power. And actually, by this chapter, he's been put into such a position of power. He's in power over everyone else. He's sort of the king's right-hand man. Why is that important? Well, the Amaleks descend all the way back in the Bible to Esau, the brother of Jacob. And if you know your biblical history at all, you'll know that Jacob and Esau didn't exactly get on. In fact, Jacob managed to get Esau to sell his birthright for a bowl of stew, which is an awfully big price to pay for a bowl of stew. And so there's this conflict that begins right there with Jacob and Esau. And Esau hates his brother, and Jacob and Esau, there's a whole history there of them being against each other, and it's fixed for a while and then it's not fixed. But this tribe of Amalek, this comes from Esau. Esau's grandson was called Amalek, and a tribe then came up from this grandson of Esau, Amalek. And so you've got that first, right at the beginning there, between Jacob and Esau, that first conflict. But that conflict continues because the Amaleks were the first nation to attack the Jewish people after their exodus from Egypt. And then later on in 1 Samuel, God instructs King Saul to attack and destroy the Amaleks. He tells King Saul to wipe the Amaleks out. And if you read it's 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, you'll find out that Saul actually didn't do this. He did attack them and he utterly defeated them, but he kept cattle and sheep to himself. They hoarded, they looted, and God had told them not just to kill the people, to wipe the whole nation out, including all of the livestock. And so he went against God on this. But more importantly to this story, King Saul spares the king of the Amaleks, or the Amalekians, King Agag. And it tells us in Esther, this man Haman is descended from King Agag. So you can see right here, King Saul should have killed King Agag, and he didn't. And here we have, hundreds of years later, this man descended from the king of the Amaleks, and he's got it out for the Jews. Goes on in Samuel 2, where Amalek then raises out again, and King Saul again goes out to battle with them. And on this occasion, this is the end of King Saul. So King Saul is defeated, and King Saul is killed by an Amalek. It then goes on. David then finally defeats them, and David is crowned king of Israel. Now, do you remember what I told you to remember last week? Mordecai was from the tribe of Benjamin. He is a descendant of King Saul. Here we are, hundreds of years later in Persia, and we have a descendant of Saul, the tribe of Benjamin, and we have a descendant of King Agag from the Amaleks. These people were at war together. There's this history there. God wanted them utterly destroyed, and Saul didn't do it. In fact, if Saul had done what God had told him, this man Haman wouldn't even be here right now, attempting to commit genocide against the Jews in Persia. So we've got the villain of the story in chapter 3 has now arrived. He's taken center stage. And as I said, we saw in chapter 2, Mordecai setting this example of living a good, godly, honorable life in an ungodly society. But now that is put to the test. And when the king orders that everybody should pay respect to Haman, Mordecai doesn't. And again, we see this idea of Mordecai. He's in the court of the king. We were saying last week, he had to have a reason to be there. So he's one of the officials, but Haman is over him. Haman is his boss, effectively. But the king has decreed that this man should have respect paid to him. Mordecai takes a stand and he refuses to do it. And it might seem a little strange at first because he is paying respect, he is bowing down to King Xerxes. And he's refusing to bow down to this man Haman. Well, first of all, Haman's not king. So there's a big difference between being respectful to the king and being respectful to this man. You've also got to remember, as we said last week, that Persia liberated the Jews in Babylon. And despite clear anti-Semitism in this culture, Mordecai and the Jews are also doing fairly all right for themselves in this society at the moment. And you remember last week I mentioned the letter in Jeremiah 29 encouraging them to settle down in exile. And of course, you're not going to do that if you're not being honorable to the king of the lands that you are exiled to. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us exactly why Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman, but it's clear as we've just looked at his history and who this man is, and that whole history coming through between the Amaleks and between the tribe of Benjamin and between Israel. It's clear that Mordecai decides to draw a line here. He clearly decides that honoring Haman would not be honoring to God. And so now he's stuck in this position because he's kept, he's a Jew, quiet. He's told Esther to keep the fact she's a Jew quiet, but he's still living honorably. He's still honoring God. But now he's saying, I can't do that. And he refuses to bow down and pay respect to this man, Haman. It's not just an old grudge. It's not just, oh, well, my granddad's granddad's granddad. Because what does Haman do when he finds out that Mordecai won't bow down to him? He doesn't just go after Mordecai, and actually, he could have done. He could have gone straight to the king and said, hey, look, you decreed that I should be respected, and here's this guy Mordecai not doing it, and that would have been the end of Mordecai. Haman doesn't do that. He goes, hang on, this guy's a Jew. He's great. Here we go. And he starts plotting for how he can turn this around to attack all of the Jews in Persia. It's clear that these anti-Semitic feelings were not hidden. It's clear that this man didn't like the Jews. It's not just the fact that he's descended from the Amaleks. Mordecai and Esther are keeping their Jewishness quiet for a reason, and that reason is men like this that are out to get them. And this is a big deal. It's a big deal that Mordecai takes this stand and refuses to bow down to him. And then he doesn't make a big show of it. He just doesn't do it, and they come to him and they say, well, why aren't you giving respect to Haman? And it tells us they come to him day after day. So it's almost like they were like, Mordecai, come on, trying to give him a chance before they got him in trouble. Come on, he's bowing, and he won't do it. And in the end, he tells them why. He tells them he's a Jew. He tells them it wouldn't be honoring to God. He's just outed himself. He told Esther, he told his daughter, don't tell them you're a Jew. He's just outed himself because when push came to shove, he knew that he couldn't compromise. To put this in sort of context for today, to really understand why he did this, imagine Hitler. Imagine Hitler had children. Imagine those children somehow found themselves in Britain and they grew up here in secret. And now Hitler's great grandson is a member of our government. He's an MP, and in all of the nonsense recently, he's managed to get himself into a position in the cabinet. So he's a powerful man in government today, and he starts putting forward anti-Semitic legislation and starts attacking Jews and attacking Christians in this country. Is that someone that you would pay respect to? Is that someone that you would bow down to? Or is this someone that we would say, no, we're not for this guy, we're against this guy? This is what Mordecai is faced with. And he says, no, I can't do it. I cannot pay respect to this man. Jesus says in John 15, if you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. We're in this world, but we're not of it. And Mordecai gives us a perfect example of that here. He is in this Persian world, but he's not of it. And so the question this morning is, what would you do? Would you stand firm in gospel truth, or will you let your faith be watered down? Will you, like Mordecai, draw a line in the sand and take a stand for what you believe in, a stand for God, or will you compromise to fit in with culture, to fit in with society around you, to pursue things that you want to pursue, even though you know they're ungodly? The last 2 weeks, we've been engaging with Open Doors and their launch of the World Watch List. Last 2 Wednesdays and Tuesday this week, we've been praying into these things. We've been hearing about the most persecuted Christians in the world. And there was a short video that I watched, and it asked these 3 questions. It asked, what would you dare to do for Jesus? Would you defy dictators? Would you worship in secret? Would you sacrifice your safety? Mordecai has been worshipping God in secret in this Persian society. It's clearly dangerous for him to be openly Jewish. But he's been doing it, he's been staying true to God, living honorably in this society. And yet he defies Haman by not bowing down to him. And more importantly, he knew this was an edict of the king. He knew that the king had ordered Haman be respected. He defies King Xerxes and refuses to bow down. And he's sacrificed his safety by doing that, by putting God first and saying, no, I am Jewish. I am one of God's people. We too can say, no, I am a follower of Christ. I am one of God's people, and take a stand. On Wednesday evening, we heard about a man called Pastor Gideon. That wasn't actually his name. They changed it for his safety. But Pastor Gideon's from a country called Eritrea. And Eritrea is 4th on the World Watch List. Very high. Lots of persecution of our Christians, brothers and sisters there. And what we've heard is that this man, Pastor Gideon, was arrested and put in prison for being a Christian. That was his only reason for being arrested. He hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't committed any crimes. He's a Christian. So they arrest him and they put him in prison. And he was in prison for 6 years. And that's not like a prison here, where you get your 3 square meals a day and you get your time out in the yard and get privileges. They had 2 slices of bread a day, never any clean water, were regularly beaten. And he was offered on many occasions, as were many other believers that were in jail with him, to denounce God, and they'd let them free. Say no to God, out we go. They refused to do this. Gideon was in prison for 6 years because he refused to compromise his faith. Last week and this week, Mordecai has shown us that we must live in a way that glorifies God, even living in a non-believing world. That we must do what is true and noble and right and pure and lovely and admirable in the eyes of the Lord. And that we can't compromise that. That sometimes that leads us to have to take a stand, to draw a line in the sand and say, no, I'm not going to do that. But how does that actually look for us living in England today? We're incredibly fortunate that there aren't police storming through that door right now to arrest us all just for worshipping God. And so I can look at Mordecai, I can tell you about this man, Pastor Gideon, and it's so stark because that contrast is there. And yet here in Britain, sometimes I think it's actually harder for us to do this because it's not so clear cut. But we do live in an ungodly society. And we can do what Mordecai does. And just simply say, no, I'm not going to do that because I believe in God, because I follow Jesus. It's not to say that we shouldn't speak up sometimes. Proverbs 31 tells us, speak up for those who cannot speak up for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy. Jesus tells us many times to look after the poor and needy. Look at the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan had to do something. He had to stop. He had to help. So yes, sometimes being a believer means that we have to step out. We have to be loud. We have to step in for somebody and advocate for them. But actually, a lot of the time, all we have to do is what Mordecai did and just say no. He didn't make a big deal. He didn't get up in Haman's face. He didn't go to the king and say, hey, look, I'm not doing this. When everyone else was bowing down to Haman, Mordecai simply just didn't. He just didn't do it. So if your friends or your colleagues, they're talking objectively about a man or a woman, they're lustfully talking about this person. You know how those conversations go, very worldly conversations. Do you join in with those conversations? Do we laugh along with them to save face because it's awkward? Do you see yourself out of that conversation? Take a stand. No, I'm not going to join in with this talk. Slandering people, gossiping about people behind their back. That's a big one in the workplace. I've been there, and I've not done it. I've not taken a stand. I've joined it, or at the very least, I've seemed to endorse it because it's awkward to be the one that's like, well, actually, no, I'm not going to join in on this. But there should be something different about us, just like Mordecai. Everyone else is bowing down. Everyone's doing what they're supposed to do in that culture. They're obeying this ungodly king and this ungodly man, Haman. Mordecai says, no, I'm not going to do that. We too need to say no to these things in our society, these behaviors in our society, to these friends and even family around us that would behave in an ungodly way. We can't behave like that with them or go along with them. We've got to be like Mordecai. We've got to just not do it. Dan Walker, some of you will know Dan Walker. He's a journalist and a presenter. He works on BBC Breakfast, does some football presenting as well. he was on Strictly Come Dancing. I think this was last year. And they had the Halloween evening. So all of the dances were Halloween based. And Dan Walker was dressed as a lobster. Everyone thought that was a bit weird. And amazingly, the BBC breakfast show actually interviewed him about why he was a lobster when everyone else was dressed as the devil or dressed as witches. And he said that he's Christian. He talked about his faith. He talked about the fact that in his family, they don't celebrate Halloween, but instead his kids go to a light party. He just didn't do it. He didn't make a big scene. Everyone else dressing up, taking part in this event. And he said, well, I'm not going to do that. And the BBC amazingly let him instead do a different dance and something completely unrelated. And then even more amazingly, actually let him go on live television and tell the nation that he was putting God first. Because they came to him and they asked him, and said, well, why aren't you doing this? They came to Mordecai and they asked him, why aren't you doing this? Now, sometimes that's not going to go well, because sometimes you're going to end up getting persecuted. Maybe not, almost definitely not today in Britain in the way that Mordecai is. Jesus tells us in Matthew 5, blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Sometimes you're going to say no, you're just not going to do it, and people are going to notice, and you're going to get it in the neck, especially if they come to you and say, well, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you joining in on this joke? Why aren't you joining in with this banter? Why aren't you coming to the strip club for this night out with the guys? Why aren't you doing these things? And you say, well, because I'm a Christian, I believe in God, and I don't believe in behaving like that. You're going to get it in the neck sometimes. You know, oh, you think you're better than us, or oh, what do you believe in this for? We're going to get it in the neck. It's going to be hard sometimes. It's going to hurt. In Matthew 5, Jesus goes on to talk about us being salt and light. There should be something about us that's different, that sticks out. A light in the darkness sticks out. You can taste salt. You put salt in stuff, you can taste it. It sticks out. There should be something about us that sticks out. Yes, there are times to talk out. Yes, there are times to spread the gospel. Often there are times to just say no and not do what everybody else is doing, because it's not godly, because it's not what God would want. And you know it. You feel the Spirit in you. You feel that Jiminy Cricket on your shoulder. You know the times when not to do these things. Won't always lead to persecution, because sometimes it goes the other way. Sometimes you'll have someone come up to you, and I've had this before. I had a friend come up to me and say to me, you're so different from any other tradesman I've ever worked with. Why is that? Sometimes people will see something in us that maybe they want, or maybe they admire, or maybe they're just simply curious. What's different? And you never know what God's going to do in those situations. But it's great that people come and ask you, and you're able to then share with them, well, this is why I've not been joining in with this, or I've not been doing that. It's because I believe in Jesus, and let me tell you about Jesus. I have a visual aid to leave you all with this morning, so excuse me. No compromise. This is a very old t-shirt. This t-shirt is about 20 years old and it's tight. It used to be a little bit slimmer back then, obviously. But this was when me and Kezia, we were teenagers, and our church decided to get together with some other churches and start a monthly worship and teaching event for youth in South East London where we lived. It was a huge event held in the church hall, where all these different teenagers that were brought in from different churches, so believers brought in, but there were so many teenagers and they were bringing along friends as well. And they were coming in and spend an evening once a month, a Sunday evening once a month, praising God, and then have a short story. Someone would do a 5-minute talk on God as well. And they named it No Compromise, because the whole point of it was teaching this next generation of Christians to not compromise on their faith, to not compromise when it comes to God, to be different, to be salt and light, and to stick out. And so Kezia had read through what I was preaching on today. We always get Kezia to check through, and she often gives me helpful insights. And on this occasion, she said, "Do you have your old No Compromise t-shirt still?" So I think it's in the bottom of a drawer somewhere. It's, I thought it would be a fun visual thing for you all to remember Justin wearing a slightly too tight t-shirt with a silly little pig on it telling you not to compromise. But it's so important. All the jokes aside, it's so important that we don't compromise when it comes to our faith, that we don't compromise when it comes to the things of God. So let us be like Mordecai in our day-to-day lives, living honorably, conducting ourselves right in this society as much as we can do. When that tension comes in, when something happens that's not godly, that's not worldly, to just say no and to be different, to be salty, to be alive, so that people look at us and go, "Why are you not doing this?" He said, "Why are you not doing this, Mordecai? Why, Justin, are you not doing this? Why are you not doing this with us? Why are you not partaking in this with us?" Just say no. That's what Mordecai did. Don't get involved. No compromise. Let's pray.